Kia ora everyone. Welcome along to today's webinar on coaching for performance via distance. My name's Nick Everett. I'm the business manager here in New Zealand for the Institute of Managers and Leaders. Obviously, I don't need to tell you why today's webinar is vitally important. As of midnight last night here in New Zealand, the whole country went into lockdown. I think I saw the other day that Melbourne has been under stay-at-home orders for something like 200 out of the last 365 days. And even looking to the future, we've all seen the countless surveys that are coming out telling us that something like 90% of workers now want some form of flexible working arrangements, and that 50% would consider leaving their job if they weren't afforded some sort of flexibility in that kind of post-COVID world, if we can even call it that at this stage. So it does appear that hybrid and remote teams are very much here to stay in some form or another. So yeah, what we're going to do today is, I suppose, take a look at using that hybrid model and the remote model for coaching our teams. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. This webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes to an hour. We'll include a 10-minute Q&A session at the end. If you do want to submit a question, please use that question tab, send your question through. You can type that in at all times during the webinar, and we will then review and hopefully respond to all of those at the conclusion. And of course, we're always happy to send you through slides and resources at the conclusion as well, so please get in touch with us. I'll pop up an email address that you can contact us on at the end so that you can access those slides and resources if you wish. So our guest speaker for today is Marnie Cook, and if you've attended one of our recent development days or something similar, you may have seen Marnie before. She has an impressive resume, having worked across a number of sectors, including automotive, pharmaceutical, health, fashion, professional services, and travel. She's worked as a consultant, advisor, educator, mentor, and a facilitator. So Marnie, I've got to ask you first up, which of those roles do you enjoy the most?
Oh, definitely facilitator, educator. And I put under that banner, coach and mentor, but I love being less of a lecturer and more of a facilitator. I think we learn so much from one another. However, we do have times where we've still got to be the lecturer, a little bit like today, because it's a little bit one way. We have to make the most of those opportunities where we can share information this way, thanks to technology. But definitely facilitation is my favourite thing.
Nice. I also couldn't help but noticing on your bio there that that word wine popped up a couple of times, and you've held multiple roles in the wine industry. I wonder if you could give us your top tip. What are you drinking at the moment?
Oh my goodness. Well, anything Australian is the answer, and I must admit I'm a very proud South Australian, and the flag that I fly most often is McLaren Vale as a region. So McLaren Vale, some of you may not realise, make all sorts of wine. So you can get just about anything you'd like from the McLaren Vale region, which is only 40 minutes from the Adelaide CBD. So it's just a beautiful place to visit. It's right by the sea. It's absolutely gorgeous. But I'm really focusing. I used to be very, very partial to a bit of champagne, but certainly in the last 18 months, given what's been going on with everything from COVID to fires to export dramas with China, drink Australian wine.
Nice. And bringing it back to the topic at hand, I know recently you facilitated our Virtual Essentials program. As part of that, I know that you conduct a coaching call with each of those participants, so they get to, I guess, learn about coaching themselves and experience coaching firsthand. So when you're doing a remote coaching call, do you prefer a phone call or a video call?
I like video to start with, just so that you can see each other's faces, especially in this environment. Following that, I actually have found, and this is interesting, I found people are freer and more open on the phone. I think it's something about having a camera. I just think, I used to teach negotiation quite a lot, and some clients would insist that there be a camera in the room so that people could review their body language. The reality is body language and behaviour changes the minute there's a camera. So, and I am conscious of that with, all meetings and training being online. So the answer is do what the person being coached prefers, I think, because they need to get out of it what they need to get out of it. But I am now really starting to read more and learn more about this whole idea of camera fatigue, which actually does make sense.
100% makes sense. It's a top tip. That's good to know. So what we'll do now, we'll get stuck into it. I'll hand it over to you. I'll be sitting here in the background, and I'll jump back on to help answer those questions at the end. So over to you, Marnie. Take it away.
Excellent, thank you. Well, as we just said, it's going to be about 40 odd minutes from now of content, if you like, in terms of the best information I can possibly share with you in the time that we have available. And I just want to leave some time for questions at the end, as I mentioned. But it's really interesting. I've run topics and workshops on this for 18 months. And it's interesting because we're learning so much very quickly about, like I mentioned, things like camera fatigue and so on, and how people are feeling differently throughout the last 18 months about working from home and flexibility and so on. So I'm going to shed a little bit of light on that and what's been going on. But the most important message that I'm going to share with you throughout the day is this idea of compliance versus a coaching mentality. So, and once upon a time, leaders were taught to check for compliance and, issue instructions and then check and follow up that they had been complied with, and then monitor the results and report on that and so on. And that's simply not working by distance. And there's a very good reason for that, which I'm hoping that you have a good, thorough understanding of by the end of the session. So today we'll look at that, the compliance versus coaching mindset. Now, another term that you might have heard of, and especially if you've been on my webinars before, is this idea of participative leadership. Sometimes you'll hear of it spoken about as team-based leadership, but the idea is giving more control to the team. So instead of the leader being dictator, judge, jury, order giver, and so on, it's more about thinking about how we can facilitate, as I said before, I love facilitating, facilitate, enable, and empower teams and individuals to do work as the best they possibly can, even when no one's looking, which is very much the case these days. To do that, the main ingredient is the way in which you communicate. So that's the main way we shift from compliance to participative leadership mode or coaching mode. So I'm going to share with you some tips on that. I'm also going to look at the GROW model. Some of you will have heard of that before, but I want to share that with you because it's a really great way to start to move and change gears more into a questioning mode and coaching mode versus issuing instruction, whether it's via phone, email, or whatever, and then checking for compliance. So I'll step you through those tools and techniques. So to give you a little bit more detail, some of you will have seen this before in that I think it highlights quite well the change that we're seeking from compliance to more performance orientation. So you'll see here on the left-hand side of the slides, it wasn't very long ago, it was probably only about 20 years ago, we were still teaching people how to command and control, how to execute orders, how to be the holder of knowledge and order giver. And that has changed significantly for lots of reasons, mainly because we know a whole lot more about what drives people and what drives employees. And remember, we're people first, we're employees second. So I think it was a mistake for us to think that we were different at home to what we were at work. And just earlier today, Nick and I were just discussing how through this online world now that we're very much living in, it's actually made things a little bit more real in that we are more actively recognising that there are blurred boundaries between our personal lives and our work lives. And we've all been very busy in hiding our personal things, whether that be the dog barking or someone knocking on the door or a baby crying in the background. But that's real life. So I guess the methodology now that we're talking about with managers and leaders is more about accepting the real behaviours and the real drivers of people so that they can be their very best at work. So that means shifting to a different leadership style, which is more like we have along here on the right, being more of the communicator, the coach, the mentor. So how can I get the best out of my people and my team, as opposed to I'm the one running the show. I need this person and this person and this person to do X, Y, and Z to help me fulfill my roles. Instead, how do I, as a leader, help my team to achieve their goals? So it turns it on its head a little bit. Some of you will have been familiar with the situational leadership, and it certainly does relate to that model. But the thinking is more about coaching and empowering rather than directing and commanding. Now, I wanted to share this with you. Many studies have been done, in particular over about the last 15 years, most significantly in this country, and shortly before that in the US and the UK, looking at the ingredients of employee engagement. Now, I'm going to start by explaining what I mean by that. Employee engagement is not just about happy employees. And I think for a period of time, we started to look at what makes people happy at work. But happiness isn't enough. We've got to be productive as well. So engagement is happiness plus productivity, because one or the other is very short term. You can have happy employees who are not achieving anything, or you can have very productive employees who may end up getting burnt out or may decide to move on because they're not deriving a sense of value from the work that they do. So engagement is a metric that looks at both. And academics, workplaces, lots of industry associations have been looking at what those ingredients are, if you like. And what we know is that employee engagement requires connectivity. And isn't that interesting? Because of course, over the last 18 months, that's something that we've been really missing. And I think it really does highlight how important that is as a human attribute. So connectivity and connection, a sense of connection with others as human beings, but not just with other people, but with a vision, with a mission, with values, being able to be connected to a shared goal, if you like. That's always been important. So this is not just COVID stuff. This has always been important, and COVID has put a spotlight on it, I think. Flexibility has always been important. So we can go back to reports right before 2005 that said your employees want a flexible work environment. They want to be able to work to achieve their work goals from anywhere. So for instance, if the job can be done from home, they want the opportunity to be able to do it from home. Not necessarily all the time, but certainly as it suits. Flexibility could include the hours at which when I get my work done. It could include where I sit in the office. So flexibility has been an important driver, and you see I've got connected and flexibility both there in bold. Reward for risk taking has always been very important for employee engagement. Autonomy, variety, and identity. So there are three factors that relate specifically to motivation, and there are actually lots of motivation models that look at those specifically. But here's what I want to point out to you. In a hybrid or in a by distance working model, those very factors are being challenged. Let me give you an example. Autonomy is the degree to which we have control over the work that we do, or when we do the work. So it relates very much to flexibility. Do I have a say as to how, when, to what degree I do my work, or even in an extreme case, the nature of the work that I do? Everyone wants autonomy, but everyone wants different amounts. So it's a variable. It's not the same for everybody. And even for one person, for me, when I'm starting a new role, I want less autonomy, because I'm just getting my head around it. Just tell me how to do the job. As I get more skilled, I want more autonomy. Let me go. I'm going to figure out how to do it my way. I now have the skills, knowledge, and the experience that I can make some choices and desire a greater sense of control. So everybody has a different amount of autonomy that's optimal for them. Now, when we're popping people into a home working environment, we know that sometimes people can feel like they have too much autonomy. That is not enough guidance. If we have too little autonomy, we feel as though we've been micromanaged. That very factor is being challenged in this hybrid workplace, because some managers, because they're not physically there in the same office, are overdoing it. So they're micromanaging even by distance, and then impacting that sort of sense of autonomy for the workers. And the issue is you can have 10 people in your team and they all require a different amount of autonomy. So knowing your people is really critical there. On the other hand, some are feeling like, I really don't know how to best do this, and then they feel concerned about picking up the phone or emailing all the time to try and get the right amount of direction. So too much and too little autonomy is a problem for engagement. And remember, it's one size fits one. Variety is similar. Everybody likes an optimal amount of variety. Not everyone likes a lot. Not everyone likes a little. It's an optimal amount, and it varies, again, on our skill level, how long we've been in the job, our experience and so on, but it can also be a personality factor. What we know is with people working away from the office is there can be a sense of monotony. So that variety metric is now being challenged. So think about that in terms of motivating your people and being able to think about their optimal performance. For them to perform their best, they need the right amount of variety. And sometimes the simple act of being in a workplace with other people provides that variety. So think about that and how perhaps roles can be circulated throughout a team to minimise that sense of people feeling like they've got too little variety, or too much if they're now having to do the job of many, because some workplaces have had to lose staff, which can result in everybody having to take on more than perhaps was their traditional role. Identity is the next one. Identity is about that sense of connection with the big picture. Physicality is one of those important things when it comes to the big picture. So, you know, if I'm physically in the office, or I can physically see the CEO sitting over there in that place in my workplace, or I can physically see the product being made, the end result, the big picture, that has a strong connection with my sense of identity and my sense of contribution to the whole. Once we separate ourselves, so this relates to connectedness, once we separate ourselves from that, again, our motivation can cop a little bit of a hit. So that's really important. I guess identity is something to think about a little bit differently to autonomy and variety, in that you probably never have too much sense of identity. So more is more. Whereas autonomy and variety, remember, you can have a little bit too much or a little bit too little, or a lot too much or a lot too little. So think about having conversations with your people about those three things, about the amount of variety, how that can be improved, about the amount of autonomy that's right for them, and also about how to create that sense of connectivity with the big picture, the end goal, the vision, mission, values, and so on. Now, in order to really achieve employee engagement, would you believe, of all of the factors that we know about that contribute to employee engagement, the number one factor, as in we can add up all of the others and it's still less than the number one factor. So more than 50% of employee engagement comes from my line manager. So that is my relationship with my line manager a good one? And overwhelmingly, that's the most important thing, because that impacts my sense of culture, my sense of flexibility, my sense of autonomy, my sense of variety, my sense of connectivity. And the number one way in which that leadership is communicated is, of course, through communication that's used. So you might be a great leader, but you might not be communicating the right things, or you might not be communicating the right way. So communication and leadership, participative leadership, is really important there. Now, I probably don't need to show you this slide, but I do want to emphasise the impact of disengagement. So, I mean, it's probably fair to say, if I go back to that previous slide, the opposite of this stuff is what results in disengagement. But I want to go beyond that. So disengagement's really dangerous, because once upon a time we used to talk about absenteeism. We've got a bigger problem now, presenteeism. That is people that are at work, but they're actually not productive, and in fact can end up really diminishing the outputs of the team. So you might have a team member who is actively disengaged. Not only are they not doing their work, but actually they can be negatively impacting on others, which is worse than them being absent. So I really wanted to highlight the importance of that. Disengagement is something that we really want to avoid. So of course it's the opposite of the previous slide we just looked at, but it's also think about it as a disengaged employee feels as though a promise has been broken to them. That's essentially how they end up feeling. It might be that they feel like they could do their job better in a certain way, but they're not allowed to. It could be that they believed that they were signing up for a certain job, but the job looked very different when they began. It could be that now that they're working from home, they feel like they're not getting that sense of contribution, or that it's overly rigid now because of the way in which they must work. So that disconnectedness, sense of inflexibility, because choice has been removed from all of us, really impacts our sense of engagement. Now, there are some things that are actually outside of our control. So whilst we can all probably imagine a world which would look a lot better than it currently is, understandably, what are the things that we can control? And one of them is the way in which we lead, how we coach our people, and also the way that we communicate, particularly when we're relating to tasks and behaviours. Now, I wanted to share this slide with you because I think what's a particular challenge at the moment, especially by distance, is to tackle behavioural issues. So a really good leader gives feedback and coaches their people on not just how to improve the tasks and the things that they need to do day to day, but also the way in which they conduct themselves, the way in which they perform their role, the behaviours. Tasks are relatively easy because, of course, tasks are tangible. There's normally some sort of report that says it was done right or it was done wrong, it was done enough or it wasn't done enough. So, for instance, it could be sales, it could be filing reports, it could be packing orders. They're typically easier to measure. This was done correctly or it was done incorrectly. It was done too slowly, for example. And they tend not to be too personal. Usually we've got tasks listed in our position description, so we know specifically what are the actions or things that we're supposed to be doing. On the other hand, behaviours often are not. So behaviours often don't appear anywhere in a position description. Some do, but that's an area that most organisations could probably improve in, is embedding those behaviours, as opposed to just having it as a separate values statement in an organisation, but embedding it into a position description. Not only what am I supposed to do, but how should I be conducting myself when I do that? It could be teamwork, it could be integrity, it could be customer centricity, those sorts of things. The tricky thing with managing those is they are intangible, they are subjective, often they're not written down anywhere, and there's rarely a report that can spit it out and say, yes, that was achieved, or no, it wasn't. So it tends to be assessed quite subjectively. Even harder now when we put distance between us. So how do we then manage behaviours effectively to drive optimal performance? How do we give feedback on those things and coach people to improve when it's so very difficult when we're each sitting behind separate computers in separate workplaces, or we're in the same workplace and we've got a mask on our face, thus engendering different behaviours again. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, the simple act of having a camera in front of us changes our behaviours, changes perhaps what we're prepared to share, might even change what we share, not just how we share it. Certainly in meetings, for instance, we might all be sitting around a table, but it's not all eyes on us all the time. So we might get up and walk away to the bathroom, or we might be able to, look down and write something down. But now when there's all heads on a screen, it feels to people as though they're under watch, under scrutiny the whole time, which is showing through reports to be creating a different type of fatigue. So we need to be conscious of that. Sometimes also our body language can be misinterpreted when we're looking through a screen. So think about those sorts of issues too. In terms of tools to be able to drive that, this is a fairly standard process that you would have seen. And I've got it as a triangle here because it's the most foundational level here, it's like a pyramid, is setting expectations. So don't be afraid of making really clear expectations, especially when people are now working separately. Even if they're in the same office together, they're now separated by distance, often in different offices to where they previously were, and often under masks. So whether they're at home in different locations or in different locations in the workplace, talk about expectations. Talk about, there might be 3 people that used to do this job, but now because of separation and distance, there's only going to be 1. What does that look like? Re-clarify your expectations of the role now that, and even if you have been doing this for, those of you in Victoria who have been working from home or by distance for the last, well, I think, what did Nick say, 200 out of 365 days? It's not too late to go back and have those conversations about expectations. What does this look like? How are we going to manage this? Do we really need to have daily Zoom meetings, or could we do things differently? Unpacking what that looks like, particularly when you're talking about behaviours. So one way to make tangible a behaviour is to talk about what it looks like in practice. So for instance, how will we demonstrate by distance that we are contributing to one another's goals as a team, for instance? How will we demonstrate customer centricity when we're now separated much further from the customer? What will that look like in this new environment? And talk about what it looks like in practice. And it's really great to do that as a team. So instead of maybe just having your next team meeting on Zoom or on Teams or whatever, where you might be talking about actions and tasks and allocating things, maybe talk about the how of how you're going to work. What is this going to look like? How are you going to tackle things when something goes wrong? Are each of the team members accountable for the same things they were before, or has that changed? And you can talk about unpacking these behaviours as a team, which is much more interesting way to have conversations as a group than simply unpacking tasks, which can probably be done effectively on email. So when you've got your faces together, can you be brainstorming? Can you be contributing to the co-creation of what good looks like in this environment? Getting agreement and understanding is much easier if you involve people in that process to begin with, because then they own it, rather than saying, here's my expectation. Performance discussions, I'm going to talk to you about some assertive communication techniques that you can use should you need to address issues. But note that the further we go up in this model, the better job we do at each step, the less work we have to do as we get closer to the pyramid. As in, it's a bit of prevention rather than cure. It minimises the likelihood of having to have difficult conversations because you've actually got expectations that are clear. You've actually got group understanding or individual understanding because they've contributed to what that looks like through discussion, and therefore greater ownership. Greater ownership means I'm much more likely to be engaged and therefore performing my best. So the performance discussions that you get to have tend to be more positive. However, there will be times when they might not be, so I'll give you some tips for that. And then closing the loop, that is following things up so that you don't have to then initiate another difficult conversation. Rather, you would already have that embedded in this stage of your performance discussion. So, okay, well, let's see how that's going to go. Let's get back together in a week. And you've already got that conversation pre-planned so that you don't have to say, oh, hang on a minute, this issue wasn't addressed. Now I've got to have another difficult conversation. Close the loop in anticipation of the follow-up conversation. So that's your overarching process and how you can kind of adapt it to the new environment. And when I say the new environment, please resist the urge to say when things go back to normal, because I think we are going to have a new normal. I think people are now realising that. And even if we snapped our fingers overnight and said, right, COVID's gone, we would still have this residual effect of people really wanting flexibility, people really wanting autonomy. So those sorts of things have always been there. They just hadn't had such a spotlight on them in the past. Now people have had a taste of it. So now people certainly have identified the benefits to them personally and professionally to be able to work more flexibly. So I encourage you not to just wait till all of this goes away, but rather embrace it to be an employer of choice. Assertive communication techniques. I'm going to do a very high level overview of this because some of you have actually been on my other specifically assertive communication seminars. For those of you that have, this is going to be really great top up for you because it's like a new language. As I said a number of times, assertive communication is developing a new way of stringing your words together. And the more practice and the more emphasis and the more you revisit this stuff, the better. So I won't apologise too much for going over this ground again for those of you that have heard it before. For those of you that haven't, I really encourage you to learn more about it because today we'll only touch the surface because of our time constraints. But this is something that I've been learning about for the last 20 years, this idea of assertive communication, and I use it with respect to driving performance management discussions, having resolving conflict in the workplace, addressing conflict that I might be involved with. It might be at work and it might be personally. It's a really important negotiation technique, but it's actually a really polite, simple, and effective way of communicating that sits really nicely with participative leadership, and it becomes your #1 coaching tool. And it's the suite of rules, if you like. So assertive communication, by definition, allows you to assert your point of view, but at the same time upholding the esteem and the rights of the other party. So it's, some of you might have heard of communication, you know, win-win or win-lose type communication, which is often talked about in negotiation. What we want to do is make sure everybody wins. So it's a really great way of achieving that. Some of these next points are a little bit cliche, but they're very important. Solution oriented. So what we say is we focus on the solution, not the problem. Focus on the situation, not the person. These are all management and leadership mantras. Focus on the future, not the past. That is, again, solution orientation. Using positive language. Make sure you're encouraging buy-in and accountability and so on. Problem is, not many people teach you how to do it. So we know we should do that, but how do you do it? And these techniques I'm going to share with you are the #1 techniques to be able to achieve it. There are loads. There are hundreds of assertive communication techniques. You can Google it, you can buy a book and all of those sorts of things, but let me save you some time and give you the most important ones. If you can nail these, you're going to get, you know, 80% difference. The remaining techniques that you might be able to learn about, you might get, you know, that up to 95% or whatever. But this will give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of shifting your language from compliance to much more coaching oriented. And the first one there is active and passive voice. So that's where we're actually, it's actually a grammar technique, and you might have seen it on your computer where you get a little squiggly line under a word and it might say, please consider use of active voice or something like that. Passive voice tends to be a lengthy way of saying something. It can be a little bit stodgy when you read it. Often you see it in reports. So passive voice might say things like, it is recommended that, rather than I recommend. And that's why we see it often in business writing and report writing, because we try to depersonalize it. Active voice is the most direct way of saying something. So we might say, you know, I recommend that, or I think, or I whatever. Now, I was an economics student and I had active voice beaten out of me because I wasn't allowed to say I. It had to be, it is recommended, or the author suggests that. And it was all very formalized language to sound authoritative, to reference exactly where information came from rather than claiming it as your own. However, when we are giving positive feedback, when we are talking about a solution or something in the future, active voice is absolutely the way to go in the workplace. So you might say, you did a great job, you won the race, you made the customer really happy. Active voice, the construct is who did what. So it could be, I won the race. It could be, you won the race. It could be, I ate the cake. It could be, as I put there, you missed the deadline. It's the most direct way of saying something. Problem with direct is if you're dealing with a problem or something negative or past orientation, it can come across as accusatory. So what we want to do is remove the you. So use active voice for positive. That is, you did a great job. However, if it's negative or past or problem-centric, consider using passive voice. That is, the deadline was missed, or an error was made, or the customer was upset, rather than you upset the customer, or you made an error, or you missed the deadline. So it's just a bit of word gymnastics there. It alters what people hear, and it certainly focuses more on the situation than making it personal. Really great one there for behaviours too, when we want to depersonalise things. However, that is still, using that technique's not enough. And if I go back to my set of rules here on my previous slide, you can see that whilst that might be focusing on the situation and not the person, it does depersonalise it by removing that you and therefore the blame and the idea of this barrier going up. It's not terribly solution focused. It's not terribly future focused. So what we can do there is add a question. The deadline was missed. What happened? The deadline was missed. How can you make sure that that makes its way to me by 4 o'clock every Tuesday? Or the customer is upset. What happened? So it's a passive plus a question, P plus Q. And for me, that's what I use 80% of the time. And what it does by asking a question is the person who's answering the question now feels empowered. They have ownership of the answer. It's not accusatory. They feel like they can share their information, and then it's leading towards a solution-oriented statement. Remember, it should be an open question as opposed to, do you understand? Which I always say is a type of statement disguised as a question. So a true open question that starts with who, what, when, where, how, or why. So the beauty of that is it does tend to lead towards agreement and ownership, and you're much more likely for that team member then to be really working towards achievement of that goal. They become more engaged and they become more involved with the achievement of that goal. So the deadline was missed, what happened? Or the order was late. What are your ideas about how it can be done on time next time? And so on. The point that I want to go back up to now is this idea of positive language. So we've talked about your passive voice plus question. Let's go back up to positive language. And I don't mean pretty la-la dance around the issue language. It's still a direct way of communicating. However, there's some rules of thumb, and to make it easy for you to remember, I've got these 3 points that I've kind of distilled from a whole lot of study that's been done in this area. Don't say don't is the first one. And that means use the positive version, not the cup half empty version. The brain doesn't visualize don't very well. The brain visualizes action words and positive action words. So when I say to you, close the door, you can visualize that. But when I say to you, don't slam the door, it's very difficult to see what that looks like in practice. And if we can visualize don't, normally looks pretty ugly. It might be, you know, a hand like that or a telling off or something like that. So instead of saying don't slam the door, we'd say close the door quietly. Instead of saying don't miss the deadline, we'd say get it to me by Friday. So that is use the positive, because the brain finds that much, much easier to digest. And also, people don't feel like they're being told off. So it results in a less compliance-oriented perception. Never say never. So what do I mean by that? Avoid absolute terms, things like always, never, constantly. I'm not too fussed for you to use them if it's in a positive context. However, if you're dealing with something difficult, negative, avoid it. So avoid an absolute plus negative statement. For instance, you're always late. For instance, you never meet the deadline. Or you're always letting down the team. Instead, what can you do? Be specific. So instead of saying you're always late, instead you might say on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, I saw that the start time was 10 past 9. And then you might have a question. What's going on? What can be done about that? What's happening? How can that be improved? What's getting in your way? So don't say don't, never say never. And thirdly, suspend judgment. Our English language is peppered with judgment-laden words, and they are otherwise known as adjectives, so describing words. So I might say, oh, that's a beautiful painting, and someone else can look at the very same thing and think, oh, that's a terrible painting. So judgments always come from a point of view. Adjectives come from a point of view, and when coupled with something negative, it's a dangerous sign, and it leads to compliance orientation at best. And what we want, remember, is engagement today. So instead of using judgy language, or as my 16-year-old daughter would say, so judgy mum, instead we would say, we would try and be specific. So ask yourself, what leads me to that judgment? And one great judgy word in the workplace that I hear all the time is lazy. So instead of addressing lazy as a behaviour, think about what is it that's leading me to that judgment? And it might be that they turn up to the meeting late. It might be that they're missing the deadline. It might be that they don't pitch in when other people are responsible for a job. They don't pitch in and help. Address that. Don't address the judgment you assign to it, if that makes sense. 4-part statements, and I want you to all have your pens out now, because this is when you need to really up the ante. Your 4-part statement is when is the first part of your 4-part statement, and that's how you're going to address a scenario. So when the deadline is missed, I is the next bit, I ... So that's the impact. The impact could be I, or it could be somebody else. So when the deadline is missed, I'm concerned that the customer is going to make a complaint. The next bit is the because, which is the reason why. And that's really great for someone who might not already know. If the because ought to be known or already is known, leave it out and make it a 3-part statement, because otherwise you might sound a bit patronising. So when the deadline is missed, I'm concerned because there's another 4 hours of work to be done on that, and the deadline's in 2. And the last part is usually, hopefully, a question. So, and it's a solutions-oriented question. So that's where you're changing gears. So you can apply that open questioning technique. What can be done about this? When can you get this to me by? How are you going to make sure next time? Now, in that 4th part, which is about the solution, you may put you in there, because it's about solution and it's about future. So I'm happy for you to use the word you there, but avoid it in the first bit when describing the situation. So in your when part of your 4-part statement, when the deadline was missed, use passive voice. When the deadline was missed, impact is because, and then the last bit, what can be done about this? How can you make sure? What are you going to do differently? So that's a really, really great coaching technique. And last of all, as I mentioned, close the loop, especially if you feel like you're dealing with, and dare I say, a serial offender. But what I mean by that is somebody who has demonstrated perhaps lack of understanding the behavioural requirements or repeated behaviour that you want to address. Know that no matter what you say, no matter which techniques you use, it's likely to be an ongoing issue that will be improved gradually. So know that you're probably going to have a couple of conversations. So be prepared for that and schedule the next one. And then your job is to say to your team member, how are you going with that? Remember last time we talked about how are you going with that? So again, putting them in the driver's seat to be able to feel more empowered, to be able to take ownership of that which is their performance requirement, task or behavioural. And some additional little questions here, which I just think the GROW model sits really nicely with. So you'll see that emphasis is very much on questioning still. But when you're asking your team to perform their best and you're asking them to do it by distance and you're thinking about how will they possibly take ownership, how will they make a contribution, how can I coach them rather than dictate to them, how can I make sure that they feel like they've got a bit of variety or flexibility or even some more autonomy in terms of how they might like to go about the changes that they're facing. You can use this GROW model. So G standing for goals. So what is it you want to do? So that is, what's the problem to be solved? The next part there is the reality. Where are you at now? So here's the goal, but here's where I'm currently at. So it could be an improved process. It could be I need to, be able to respond to 500 emails a day, and currently I'm only responding to 300. So you're understanding the difference between where I want to be versus where I'm at. And then options. What are the options to close that gap? And then the 4th part there is what will you commit to? So what's the next step? Of the options, what are you going to do? So you see those really nice questions there. It's by no means exhaustive, but it'll just start to get you thinking like a coach, so that when there is a problem to be solved, which I have no doubt, when you are leading by distance, your team members are probably still looking to you to solve most problems. And what I'd like you to do is think about how can you help them to take greater ownership of that, thereby giving them a greater sense of engagement through perhaps increased variety in their work, but certainly autonomy, and at the same time building their skills. So asking them, what would you like to do differently? What do you see as an opportunity? What are the skills you would like to develop? And then you can work your way around that model. For some examples of some questions, you can probably think of more and add to that. I suggest to leaders that I'm working with, you have this model sitting somewhere nearby, just because it's that quick visual reference that is a reminder to be able to say, okay, hang on a minute, instead of me giving the answer, how can I help them to find the answer? And sure, it might take a bit longer, but the benefit that you're going to get through having greater engagement in your team, especially during these really challenging times, makes it so well worth it. So I really challenge you and encourage you to make that shift in thinking. I think this tool helps you to do that. At the risk of sounding like a lecturer, which I said was my least favourite role that I play. However, being able to, as I said, share and impart these really important, I guess, tools and frameworks to help you make a change quickly is still such a privilege, even though I'm feeling like I'm very much one way communicating. But hang in there, because you have the opportunity to ask questions in a moment. So just to recap, I just want to impress upon you, remember to try and be more a participative leader, a performance coach rather than a compliance manager. Even if you happen to be in the business of compliance, you can lead as a coach. Engaged teams require flexibility, like I said, autonomy and variety. And remember, everyone's optimal amount of autonomy and variety can be different, but everybody wants the right amount of flexibility. Everybody wants a sense of identity and connectivity and contribution. Ensure clarity, we all want that too. And that's certainly something that's been really tough in the last 18 months because the earth's been moving from underneath us. There's already uncertainty. So how can we ensure clarity, at least of things like expectations? So remember back to that pyramid model and go back and spend time on that foundational level, especially when we're in uncertain times, and the way in which we work has to keep changing. Develop these assertive communication skills, so practice that passive plus question or 4-part statement. And guys, you can just Google the 4-part statement, otherwise known as an I statement, and you'll see lots of different variations of it. But the point is, it allows you to tackle quite complex issues in the best possible way. And use that grow model. So when you are faced with problems that might come to you or questions that might be asked of you to solve even by distance, help others to solve their problems and allow them that opportunity to grow and learn and develop while they are, really looking for different ways to perform better. As I said, that link with ownership of the achievement of the outcome is also an excellent side effect. The more people have buy-in to the way in which they do things, the better the result. So we know that as a rule. So I leave you with those thoughts, and I can't see on my little screen just yet as to any chat questions, but I'm just going to open that up now. I can't see anything, but I'm not sure, perhaps Nick can. Sometimes you have little questions that pop up throughout, and I'm sorry it has sort of been a one-way street up until now. But if you've got a question relating to some of those things that we've covered, or even something that we haven't, please take the opportunity now, and we can, I'm sure if you've thought of something, there are plenty of others online who have the same question or thought or challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Marnie. That was fantastic. There are some questions coming through, so I will I'll jump to those now. Although I would just say, like, at IML, we're all about application, and so I always love your sessions, because even though yes, it is a one-way webinar, you give so much applicable and practical tools that you can take away and go and use. And I think the key to any learning experience is to take away what Marnie's given you today and apply that in real life, in your workplace. So even when she was talking about co-creation, using your team to co-create kind of and set expectations and guidance, give it a go. Tell them what you're doing, make it very clear. Bring the team together and give that a go. Assertive communication, when she spoke about it being a new language and you're having to develop a new way of stringing words together. Again, think of some ways where you might have to use that. Write it down. Write down how you're actually going to communicate that. Write down the 4-part sentence. Practice it. Say it. Get your tongue around how it comes out, because it is different. It's a different way of speaking. And of course, the GROW model. Like, I'm a huge fan of the GROW model. And again, you can just go and pull someone aside, and you can be very open with your team and say, look, I'm trying something different here. I'm going to use a GROW model. I've got a bunch of questions that I'm going to ask you that will hopefully help us get to an outcome here. So yeah, Marnie, loved it. And I'll jump across to some questions here. Let's see what we've got. So the first one's quite interesting. How do you avoid using the word you when you're addressing the behavior of a person? So for example, if they're talking back at you during a discussion, how do you use, I suppose, that passive to avoid the word you?
Okay. You know what I do? I probably use an I statement there. So when, for example, I might describe the situation. So I might say, okay, so when there's a team meeting and people are talking all over each other, what I'm concerned about is no one is having the opportunity to be heard. What can you do? And use you in the last bit, in the question bit, because it's solution oriented. You can use you in that bit. So what can you do to make sure other people are heard in the meeting? It might be, and you can also use positive language. So you could say, I know that you have lots of great solutions. So if you're framing it in the positive, you can use you. I know you have lots of great suggestions. I'm concerned that others aren't having their views heard. What can be done about this? You see what I mean? I'm just sort of playing with it.
Yeah, there's a way around it. You've just got to be a little bit creative and have a think about it.
And I'm still using those techniques. And do you know what I recommend? So thank you for whoever asked that question. What I recommend you do when you're faced with that, work through those techniques and find, hang on a minute, what if I use passive? How would that look? What if it was just a question? Maybe it's a solution-oriented question, i.e., how can you give others the opportunity to be heard? That's what just a question would look like. And so you can play with it. You can do a 4-part, you could do a P plus Q, you can do just a question only, making sure that we frame things positively where possible. So describing the change you want to see rather than the mistake they continue to make, right? Play with it, read it, and you'll see some looks like overkill and you go, oh no, that's not the right tool because that's like a sledgehammer. Or you might think, no, that's dancing around it too much. So play with it. And the other thing I suggest you say it out loud, because you can read stuff on the paper and it looks brilliant, but then you say it out loud and it feels stupid or it comes across as unauthentic. Say it out loud. I'd much rather you feel silly saying it out loud to yourself than having that awkward conversation that just comes out all wrong. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, beautiful. Another one here. Can you use these techniques to manage up? So I know, I guess a lot of what we've spoken about is how you can manage your team and maybe the people that are reporting to you, but does this all work? And can you use these similar techniques if you're actually trying to manage up?
Thank you. Another excellent question. Yes, you can. And they're even more important, but I'd like to throw another one into the mix if you're happy. And you'll need a pen because it's not on the slide pack. It's another 4-part statement. You shouldn't have to use extra techniques to manage up. These should still work fine. But just in case you do, and you'll know the type of leader I'm talking about that this will work for. And that's all I'm going to say. 4-part statement. First part is I respect, and that relates to ego. So what this allows you to do is if you're anticipating a barrier to be up for whatever reason when you're managing up, this is a good way to let it down, and it has the effect of opening the door so you can waltz straight through it. So I respect, so it could be I respect your experience in this area. And I understand. That's showing that you're not just going in blind like a fool about to make a stupid recommendation. So I understand, I appreciate, or I respect/appreciate. I respect your expertise or experience in this area, and I understand why the budget was cut. I'm concerned, so this is now permission to raise an issue. I'm concerned that there might be a side effect of that, and I recommend that we review the way in which those budget lines are impacted, for instance. So the first bit is I respect, the second bit is I understand, so you're showing I understand why. The next bit is looking at, a bit like the GROW model, looking at possibilities and hang on a minute, I think we need to consider something. delicately. And the third part is about solution, I recommend, or it might be solutions. I think we have 3 options, and then the leader can choose one. You know, I think we do nothing, you know, I've thought about it, and if we do nothing, do something, or here's my recommendation. So 3 options, for instance.
And I suppose just to add to that, you have to have some actual respect there for that leader, because otherwise you may come across as being ingenuine, but that could be a different issue altogether.
Yeah. And look, if you feel like you need to play with these things, the last thing I want to do is teach you to be unauthentic. But I want you to have a few tools from which you can pull and practice them. Some of you like more words, some of you like fewer words. So write it down and then ruthlessly edit after you've spoken out loud, and that's how you'll feel okay with it.
Yeah. Just got a question here asking, just to clarify, when you mention an I statement, is that the same as the 4-part statement that you explained? So that's just another term for it.
And I should point out, sometimes it's called an I statement because the when and the I, the first 2 steps, can be interchanged. I'm concerned when the deadline is missed because blah, blah, blah. So the I sometimes goes first, the when sometimes goes first, and you can choose which one, but yes, they're one and the same.
Yeah, cool. Another question here around that term co-creation, and how would you define co-creation?
You can't co-create with everything, and you can't collaborate with everything. Sometimes you've just got to say like it is. But I want you to get people complying to stuff, not to you. Comply to the law, comply to the policy, comply to the procedure or the process. However, I'm your leader and I'm going to help you to do that. So my job as a leader is to coach you through that. Your job is to, and it could be in a compliance environment. So back to that question. So to be able to say, and sorry, just repeat that just again for me so that I target in.
Yeah, so it was, oh no, I've lost it. It was just, how do you define co-creation?
Yes. So in that, understanding that you can be a coach even in a compliance environment, determine what they can contribute to. It won't necessarily be everything. So for instance, they might not be able to decide the best way to evacuate a building, but they might be able to decide the best way to refresh that training. So what can they have input into? So anything that you're doing to shift along, allowing people, so if people can co-create, for instance, right, we know this is the goal that we want to achieve, you might be able to get them to help to co-create the how. It might be just an improvement of a process. It won't necessarily be everything, but if you're identifying things that can be improved through their input, and if you feel scared about that because you're worried that they're going to raise something that's going to be impossible, please don't let that stop you, because what you can do is say, actually, within our constraints, that might be great if we had the budget all the time. And then you can start saying, what would be the consequence of that time-wise? What would be the cost? What would be the impact? Don't be afraid of asking the question about how they can contribute to things, because you're scared of then having to deliver, because then you can actually go back in and bring in those constraints.
Cool, and I might just chuck one last one in here before we run out of time, but there's a question, I guess, regarding, is now a good time to be discussing flexibility? In the past, I think there was always kind of a norm, and so then you use that as a bit of a data point to discuss flexibility. So, okay, this is the norm, let's discuss what flexibility looks like in comparison to that norm. However, currently in this, very unstable environment, VUCA, as we could maybe term it, is it actually a good time to be trying to have that flexibility discussion, or is it too difficult because there isn't that initial point to start from?
Gosh, both.
Yeah.
Both. So the way I'd tackle it is, how can we be agile? That is, we might decide something's going to suit now, but we might have to change that tomorrow. So I still think it's a really good thing. And it does put the fear of God into most leaders when I start saying this, that it's always good to talk about flexibility. And I understand the down, just like we used to say that when the online world became a big thing with websites and Facebook. And I would say you need to have a Facebook page so that your customers could interact with you. But what if they say something bad? Well, they're going to say it anyway, but you just won't know about it. And it's the same with this idea of flexibility. I think managers are a little bit scared, oh no, if I give them a little bit of rope and, you know, but I still think asking people what they want and how their experience as an employee can be improved puts you in that bucket of employer of choice. Even if you can't deliver upon that, you still got that knowledge, and you're actually demonstrating that it matters. Even if it can't be delivered on for various, it could be compliance or whatever. I think it's still good conversation. I think the pros outweigh the cons, but both are an issue, yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Hey, well, I think that's probably all we have time for. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope all of you out there have as well. As mentioned, if you do want any resources or the slides, please do email us at info@managersandleaders.com.au or .nz. Just to let you know, coming up next as well on the 8th of September is our next development day. It'll be focused around the power of positive workplace cultures. So something I think that probably links very nicely to today, and I would encourage you all to jump along and check that one out. And as mentioned, that Grow coaching model and some of the other tools that Marnie's talked about feature in a number of our leadership programs, especially the Foundations program, the next one of those, which is kicking off on the 1st of September.
See that on there. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. So,
Nick, I'll mention to our guests as well that there are a number of blogs on the website that are topical, quick read, and we'll send you a link to the one that relates to conflict in a hybrid workplace too, because that relates a lot to some of the topics we've talked about today, but use that as a resource as well.
Fantastic. So we'll include that in the resources if you want it. Amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much, Marnie. Do you have any last words as we depart?
Good luck. I'm thinking of you all. I know it's really tough, and you're all doing your best. And let's just hope that that this really tough time is over soon. Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Stay safe, everyone. Stay strong, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.